Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 6 in the series, To Love and Be Loved. Do you want to improve your capacity to love and be loved? Most people usually conclude they don't have enough of it in their families or marriages. Expanding your capacity for love is based on neurological discoveries of how brains can learn and grow. In this episode, Dr. Scoresby will explain some of this research, and you can see for yourself whether you would like more honest, true, and realistic love in your life.
Over the years of my professional life, I felt a teeny bit intimidated whenever I talk about love and its importance. If I was spending time with a married couple, the idea of love makes sense. But if I was giving a talk in public and wanted to talk about the importance of it and how to create or maintain it, it seemed to me that a lot of people would get a look on their face like, well, it's just natural and whatever you get is natural. And if you don't get a whole lot, well, then that's just naturally the way things are. But as the years have passed, I've realized that there are a lot of compelling reasons why we should spend time asking ourselves the question, how do we increase our capacity for love and for the effects of love on our lives, in our marriages, and in our families? It is true that virtually every married couple who have sought my professional services as a counselor had two problems, and I knew what they were even before I spoke with them. They did not have enough love between the two of them, nor did they have good problem-solving skills. It's very similar to when parents and children have conflict. There's not enough love transmitted between parents and children either. And there are many instances where people grow up without it, try to survive without it, and then have difficulty or problems because they're trying to seek it in ways that are not only unconventional but ineffective. Now, in light of that possibility, I decided several years ago that I would try to do something a little bit different than I had been trained to do as a psychologist from the University of Minnesota. While I was studying a lot about abnormal behavior, which most psychologists need to know, and all the diagnostic categories of different kinds of abnormal behavior, I began to feel very low and very unhappy, partly because I would look into those descriptions of mental illness and think, well, I do some of that some of the time. So I went to the library at Minnesota one time and began to search the literature to see if there was anything about positive or healthy behavior. And while it was smaller than the literature on solving problems, there is and was. So over the years, I've looked at that and thought about that and wondered, if we really were serious about this and made the love idea as important as it actually is, then we would take a look at the research, we'd take a look at things that help us decide whether or not it's possible. And the reason for that, of course, is that we hardly have anybody who complains that there's too much. Just stop this. There's too much. I cannot handle it. You hardly ever hear that. In fact, I've never heard that. I've heard questions about different methods, and those methods might not be right, but never, I have too much of it. And then where our marriages are concerned now, and we're seeing a rapid increase in depression and anxiety among our children and adults because of the pandemic, it seems to me that it might be useful for us to give greater emphasis to the idea that if we knew what love was and we knew how to create and engender it, then we might be able to be successful at avoiding a lot of the mental problems that happen and avoiding a lot of the conflict that happens between parents and children and married couples. And in addition to that, we might be able to teach married couples how to generate or create it so that they would have a form of love they probably never experienced. So in part 1, which is today, I'm going to describe a little bit about the history of how I arrived at the possibility that there was a way to expand our capacity to love. And then in subsequent parts of this series, I'm going to talk about the methods that we can use or that anybody can use to make it a reality. So first of all, I'd like to talk to you about the idea that researchers years ago discovered that the human brain organizes itself, at least the cerebral cortex, in paired opposites. So there are clusters of nerve cells. This is D.O. Hebb's research from the Canadian University, McGill. And he found that there were brain cells that represented our life experience, and these were organized inside the cerebral cortex. Now, the evidence for that had existed for a long time. It existed in the 50s when some MDs were doing brain research, or surgery, excuse me, and had cut open the skull and were looking into the brain, and there are no brain or pain sensors in the brain. So they touched certain parts of the cerebral cortex with little electrodes, very mild, and discovered that the person that they were performing surgery on, who was awake, by the way, he relived, I repeat, relived his 7th birthday. And he talked like a person 7 years old, and he told who was there and who his friends were and what he felt about them, and he displayed the emotional behavior. And so D.O. Hebb's research about there being brain clusters just supported something that, an artifact that the medical world had already discovered. So that was the beginning of a chain of events which has been quite interesting. Now, about the same time, or over the years, maybe in the 60s and 70s, some British researchers were doing research that allowed them to identify a grid. They used it as a grid to understand how brains store information, store its memories. And they discovered in the process of that research that certain categories of experiences were put together, and then the category right next to it were all the things, or many of the things, that were not, I repeat, not like the first. So whenever love is stored in the same category, then next to it there would be things that were not love and that had to do with fear and anxiety and so on. And that's where researchers first learned that one of the primary opposites of love is in fact fear. So while they were doing that, they discovered in each mental category, you could take a look at how many experiences were in it. And if there were many, it was called a rich perceptual frame. And if there were very few, it was called an impoverished mental frame. And so the idea was that through your experience, and the similar ones are all categorized and put together so that you could say, well, in this experience category, a person's had a lot, and therefore he has a rich perceptual frame for those life experiences. Now, before going forward, think about what that would mean. It would mean that an individual who had acquired a great deal of experience in one area likely was more knowledgeable, more confident, had more expertise, and likely would be more successful than an individual who was participating in something he or she knew little about, and therefore had an impoverished amount of experience. I can readily apply that to an experience I had with deer hunting. I am not a deer hunter. I don't come from a family, but I once went deer hunting. Had one of the worst experiences of my life because I got myself into a situation where I followed a trail for one time for quite a long distance, thinking it was a deer trail, only to discover that it was a sheep. And when I realized that it was a sheep, I thought I should get out of the mountains right now before I shoot an animal that I don't want to shoot or get shot myself. Now, a little while later, some researchers, neurological researchers, were studying something that they called windows. And these windows had to do with the fact that during certain periods of a child's development, the brain cells increase rapidly, exceptionally rapidly. And these brain cells occurred during period of times, and they had to do with inherited abilities. So, for example, language, which is an inherited ability, during a period of time, the brain cells for language would duplicate and increase in quantity rapidly. The same would be true for emotions and for numbers. So then they discovered the idea that during this period of time, or what they called windows, that if people saturated or increased the kinds of experiences that a baby had with the language or emotions or numbers, they could in fact produce larger concentrations of brain cells, like D.O. Hebb suggested, and forever after that, then this person would have greater access to that. And this they applied regarding infant stimulation to begin with, and did discover, at least to a certain extent, that infant stimulation can increase things like intelligence and other mental abilities of children. So then the neurologists, the modern neurologists and neuropsychologists then began to use scans where they could see the brain actually working. And when they got that ability, they were fascinated with all sorts of possibilities, one of which was they discovered the brain was highly adaptive to the experiences any individual had with its environment, and it would create specific locations for memories based on the culture of the individual. So in one of their studies, they discovered that patriotism, for example, is located in one location in an Asian person's brain, and in a British brain is different, and in American brain it's a different location altogether. But in a lot of Americans, they're in the same location, which means that the concentration of cells given to a given culture are in the same location and therefore used more readily or in the same way. If you mention patriotism to somebody in Great Britain, they might resort to talking about the king. Or if you said to them over the wall, most British people remember that as a slogan for World War I. Whereas in America, we don't have a fatherland or a motherland. We have an uncle, supposedly a kind uncle, who represents the country and wants us at times of urgency when the country is in need. So they discovered that these conditions were taking place, and then while they were watching, they discovered also this little electrical impulse that was floating around the brain. And at first, they thought that it was the thought, that they were actually watching the brain think. On one occasion, while they were looking at this, they discovered that instead of a thought, this little electrical impulse was a set of instructions to the brain of how many brain cells to build in that location because of the repetitive experiences the human being was having in regard to that area. So, for example, if a child was having a lot more positive emotions, then the brain location for positive emotions were instructed to create larger cell configurations and cell density, as it turns out, to handle all the positive emotions. And then the center next to it would be the negative emotions. And so here's what the researchers essentially included about windows. So parents who place their young children from birth to 5 is the window for emotional development. A lot of positive emotions, a lot of love and warmth and tenderness and kindness and fun and so on. Whereas a child who didn't grow up in that, so you put a 5-year-old from each life experience into the same classroom. The teacher walks in, and the child who has fewer positive brain cells would look at the teacher and think, I better watch out, this person could hurt me. And the child who grew up in a positive, emotionally positive climate would say, wow, I like her, she has a warm smile. And the idea, of course, is that based on early developmental growth, that you could influence the subsequent growth of your children. Now, later on in the last 20 years, some equally substantial, actually outstanding findings have been reported by the neurologists and neuropsychologists. One of which is the old idea that brains stop growing about the mid-20s is no longer true. They have evidence that the brain continues to grow throughout life, number one. Number two, they also have evidence that brains can in fact heal itself. So if there are problems or difficulties or brain cells die, the brain can reproduce and produce brain cells to compensate for that. They also learned that if some part of the body, let's say the hand, left hand, if the hand is no longer functional, then the center of the brain or the brain cells that are related to the left hand will atrophy. And so this brain of ours is highly adaptive and willing to be influenced by the nature of people's experience. So now this raises the interesting question. If this research is to be agreed to and understood, then is it possible for us to increase our capacity for love? And I'm going to say, oh, yes, it is, and the consequences of that are significantly important. So let me give you a couple of possibilities. This is not closely or obviously related to what love is, but it'll give you an idea about how these conditions affect performance. In the Provo Canyon Boys School, research was conducted years ago about the kids and the effects of the school on the kids. And sometimes there were no changes in them. Sometimes there were significant changes in some of the boys who attended that school. When they took the sample of those boys who made great changes, they discovered that a very high percent of them, while they were in the school, either reactivated themselves in their religious faith or they joined a religious faith where they said that they had experienced more love, more kindness, and more gratitude. And then these individuals were less likely to relapse and go back to their antisocial behavior after they were out of the school. One of my favorite research projects has to do with the social anthropologist Basil Bernstein, who in Great Britain identified the top 25% and bottom 25% of the students in school performance, and then discovered that the children who were in the top 25% came from homes where the parents used more words to explain to children what school was like. Now think about that with me just for a minute. These students who were performing better came from homes where the parents used more words, that is, gave elaborate or expanded descriptions of school and all of the possibilities, and the children who likely were equally intelligent came from homes or families where the parents talked in what it was called a restricted code. And this restricted code is where they use two words like be quiet and shut up and get off and so on. Now what that means is that the category for, in this sense, academic work had grown larger and the language had grown larger because of the environment of the children's homes. This made sense to me because I had once been a consultant to a school district in Utah, and they had received a government fund for conducting a study, and here's what they wanted to do. They had 4 elementary schools. 2 they put in the control group, which they would do nothing. The other 2 they wanted to hire teacher aides, 1 or 2 adult people from a lower socioeconomic level to provide jobs for them and give them to each teacher in each grade. So they went through a year having a fairly common curriculum. They went through the year, and at the end of the year they were testing to see if there were any differences between the 2 schools. They didn't find differences at a significant level, a statistical significant level. When they called and I asked them if they knew about orthogonal contrast, and they did, and I said, why don't you look into your data and see if there are some students who increase dramatically and see if they are different than the kids who were average or didn't increase at all. And they found that statistically that was the case. There were some students who had improved so much during that academic year that statistically they showed up and out over the children in the other control groups. Well, then you might be wondering why I'm asking the question. Who are these children's parents? And you might think about it for a minute before you recognized that their parents likely were the teacher's aides whom the school district had brought into the classroom, and these aides had learned more about school, how to function, how to be effective and successful, and therefore the kids picked it up and improved their performance at school. What does all of this mean? These are examples of the possibility we can, at any age of our life, increase our capacity for love if we know what to do and know how to go about it. So I'm going to introduce in this series a set of strategies or a combination of strategies which I've used successfully with large numbers of couples, and I believe I can generally say that those couples who carry out these assignments that I'm going to describe or apply the behavior actually do discover a form of love that makes it possible for them to satisfy the promise they make, that they will make loving their spouse the highest priority of their life after their belief and faith in God or Jesus Christ. I needed to allow for the possibility that there would be people of religious faith who would believe that was their top priority, and I have no argument with that at all. I believe it's probably the best way to live. So anyway, I've experimented with all sorts of interesting things. So the first one, I'll give at the end of this episode, and the next episodes in the series, I'll add additional ones to point out what couples could do. Here's the first one. Now, because criticism, blame, and condemnation hurt feelings, because they are often false in their meaning and sometimes true and accurate, they still hurt. But hurt, as it turns out, is remembered by the human brain as anxiety or fear. So blame and criticism and condemnation make people afraid. And they make them afraid of talking with, visiting with, or showing affection or warmth or anything to the person they believe has caused these feelings. Criticism and blame leads to a much more difficult problem. And this problem is that people in marriages often grow into their marriages believing that someone other than themselves caused what they feel. And this idea makes somebody a cause, it makes somebody a victim, or that both people think that both people are causes, or that both people think they're victims. In either case, the presence of criticism, blame, or condemnation leads to fear, and fear has a tendency to significantly limit or prevent the formation of love, and it significantly prevents the growth of it, which is what we're interested in. So the first thing you could do is to take a look at the amount of criticism and blame that you communicate to your children, to other people in the neighborhood, to your spouse, and start to significantly reduce it. Significantly reduce it until you eliminate it. If you have done that, then you will have implemented the first step in the series of how to expand your capacity for love.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.